Hey everyone. I've been working for a while to build a 3D Toon character workflow for Blender. I've had some success with cycles in the past, but the 2.8 update has changed everything. So, before 2.81 comes and changes it all again, now is a good time to share the process. Eevee has given us a lot of new tools for non-photorealistic rendering. It doesn't have a proper toon shader of its own, so we have to make one ourselves, but it's real-time, so it's convenient, and it has the shader to RGB node, which means we can convert our shaders to colors, unlike cycles. That means we can make basically any setup we want. I've used it to make my own custom path setup, where I keep shading, gloss, color, and all those things separate and easy to edit and work on their own. Since it's color, and since Eevee is real-time, you can do things like texture paint straight into your render to edit your lighting, or even export to another program and fix it up there. My current workflow uses Eevee for direct light, cycles for indirect light, and then brings it all into Krita. It's not perfect and I'm still improving it, but it's pretty functional at the moment. You can see here I was able to make fixes to the hair shading, I've got my indirect light from cycles, and I've got some line art. I won't be covering line art in this tutorial, but I'll be covering everything else about setting up this shader group. I'll be covering the theory behind how toon shaders work in Eevee at the moment and what the limitations and workarounds are, and then showing the process of building the group up from nothing, and also building a cycles group to composite in the bounce light. This tutorial is intermediate and assumes that you're already familiar with the basics of nodes, so if you haven't used cycles before, you might want to go check out some cycles tutorials first. Let's go over what the shader can do. It's Eevee, so it's practically real-time. I've got the settings pretty high in the viewport, but even like this, it resolves to full quality in about a second, and will look even better in a full render. Most of that time is just the cast shadows, which right now in Eevee are a bit of a weak point. We'll talk about that more later. The shader itself has several components. It has this very hard-edged toon diffuse, a softer, regular rough diffuse, some gloss, and then a super hard-edged, boosted, pure white gloss on the edges only. This is to massively exaggerate all the rim light. I have it turned up this high because later I'll be overlaying line art, which will cover up most of this space. So if you want any of it to still show through, you have to set it to be really bright and really thick at this stage. All of these effects, of course, respond to the key light, which in this case is a sun lamp. If we adjust it, we'll get a different layout of shadows. But as with any 3D toon shading, how good this looks artistically is really going to be dependent on the lighting. If you do a weird light angle, you're going to get weird effects, like the face right now is certainly not how anybody would ever draw this. But we actually have ways around this problem in the workflow, but we'll save that for later. The shader group has a variety of parameters to let us control different parts of the look. Inside the shader group, there are actually two versions of the shader. There is a cycles version and an Eevee version. Eevee, of course, is capable of a lot more NPR tricks. So some of these parameters go to both groups, and then some only to the Eevee group. I render both so that I can render a cycles version of the scene and then composite in the indirect light on top of the Eevee render. The common parameters up here are all the things you'd normally expect to use in a cycle shader or in the principal BSDF. We can adjust colors, we can adjust the index of refraction for how shiny different areas are, we can control our toon size, which works in the Eevee version just as it would on the cycles toon shader. We can make something an emission object. Then getting down to the Eevee specific controls, we can of course control the amount of our soft shading, down to 0, or turn it all the way up. So that can vary on different materials. Then a component of the soft shading is some ambient occlusion, and that can be controlled on its own too. Ambient occlusion in cycles has its own node with its own parameters that give you fine control of it on a per object basis. But in Eevee, it's actually controlled through the global render settings over on the right here. So whatever you put in here basically goes in any area that you use ambient occlusion in your node graph. The settings on the node itself don't actually do anything. Next, we have the ability to do one of the most important tricks in non-photorealistic rendering, and that is to adjust our colors in shadowed or glossy areas. You can see, even on this white suit, the shadows are tinted slightly blue, and that's being done here. I'm feeding my colors in from a palette group, and for my shadow override, I am taking the base color and adjusting it. And I can turn that up even more to make that more obvious. And then, of course, I have a gloss color override as well. The shadow color override changes the color in dark areas. The gloss color override changes it more in light areas of the gloss pass. Right now it's set up so that when it's black going in, nothing happens. But as I change the color, we can start to see our gloss color tint change. Let's make this way more shiny so we can actually see that. There you go. Then I also have controls for that really crazy specular. That is based on a layer weight node, and this controls the blend, which is how large it is. You can see as I turn this down, this will get thinner. And if I set it all the way to the 0, it disables completely. Of course, this is set only on the white part of the suit right now, so it's not affecting the lens, or this black area. These other fields we'll get to later. Those are for overriding the main shader group with nodes in a specific material. So, how does this all work under the hood? What's it look like inside this group? Let's see. First of all, we've got our Eevee version of the shader and a Cycles version of the shader. All our parameters are just passing straight through to the Eevee shader, with a couple other global parameters. And now if we go in here, there you go, that's the shader. Alright, you get it. Tutorial done. We can move on. Nah, seriously. The rest of the tutorial is going to be going into a test file and rebuilding most of this, but actually cleaner so that it makes sense. So let's hop over to a new file. Welcome to our test file. I'll be building up the whole node group here, and then giving this file out when the video goes out. So just follow along, don't worry about building it up yourself, you'll just be able to grab it from this file. We're starting with the most basic settings possible. We have a few objects, a single key lamp, which is a sunlight, no world lighting at all, and by that I mean it's set to black and 0 strength, and just a single diffuse node. Most of our settings don't matter. I have ambient occlusion turned on because we'll use that later, and that's about it right now. We'll go over some of those settings as we arrive on them in our node building. If we were using Cycles, we would just immediately add the Toon shader. But even though Eevee and Cycles share nodes, Eevee does not have a version of the Toon shader. If we look here, it doesn't appear in the list. If we switch over to Cycles, it would, and we could add it to the node graph, and switch back to Eevee and it would still be there, but it wouldn't do anything. In Eevee, the way you make a Toon shader is different. We have access to this magical shader to RGB node, which doesn't work in Cycles. Let's go ahead and hook that up. There we go. Now it is a Toon shader. I realize it doesn't look any different because we haven't done anything to it, but the difference is here. Before, it was a green shader output, and now it is a color output. Those who've used a lot of Cycles will know that shader outputs can only go into shader inputs, which leaves you with very few options what you can do with them. Basically, you can mix them, You can add them, and you can output them in the surface output. And that's about it. Whereas for color, you can do all sorts of stuff. You can mix them, you can curve them, you can even stick them into vector sockets, even though those are blue XYZ sockets, because it just automatically converts RGB to XYZ. So the core of any Eevee Toon shader is manipulating a node converted into color. We have a lot of options for making this look more like a Toon shader. Right now it's a fairly basic gradient from white to black passing through gray. Now, how much of this area is white is mostly dependent on the light strength. If I go and I turn up the light power to something high like 7, it's going to blow out more of this area to pure white. If I turn it down to 3, hardly anything is pure white. That actually matters quite a bit, and we'll see why in a moment. But first of all, let's look at what happens when we ramp this in different ways. Of course, the most straightforward is to use a color ramp, which is where the term comes from. So now we can adjust our points and change where is black and where is white. So the most basic of Toon shaders is mostly to move these two close together. There, now it looks more like a cell shader. We have a little bit of space in between, which leaves us a very little bit of gray gradient in the middle. Generally, you don't want to make things too hard. If you make it perfectly hard, you can have aliasing issues. Not if you're rendering at high resolution, of course. That's a matter of style, and it's up to you how much of that you want. Now, what we can see here, though, is that this doesn't actually look all that great. We have a linear gradient from black to white, and it's kind of making this smudgy shelf. If we change the interpolation type, we can make it look a bit better. Ease will soften it up a bit. It now blends out into the white a little more cleanly. Cardinal, similar but not quite as nice. And B-spline makes it blend back into the black more. We'll have to drag it up now more, but now our gradient is there. Again, which of these you'd like is mainly a stylistic choice. But unfortunately, that choice kind of gets made for us for one major reason, which is that the color ramp you basically have to set by hand, so there's not really any way to have this be driven by parameters. And this effectively controls the size of your Toon shader area. So not having any other inputs to control these stops means that everything has to be set by hand. That just doesn't really work in a shader you want to set different toon sizes on different objects. So let's look at some other options. You can, of course, just use brightness and contrast. And if you crank these settings, it's going to give you a similar effect. But you don't have all that much control. So this works, but I don't recommend it. And you can use math. The greater than node will do it. This lets you have very clear parameter control of where the cutoff is in the brightness level. This is saying everything below 0.5 is going to be pure black and everything above will be pure white. So that's pretty easy to visualize. So that is convenient, but there is no softness at all to our edge. Now there are ways to get that back with more complex math, but I don't remember how that works, so I'm not going to cover it here. We'll cover that in a later video, because there is still a more convenient way. And that is the rescale node. Well, this is 2.8 that I'm showing this in, so it's not actually a node yet. That's a new node that they added in 2.81, which may be out by the time you're watching this. And if not, I recommend switching to the nightlies soon, as they're pretty stable. In the meantime, it's always been available as a group. So we're just going to use the group version for this tutorial. If we take a look inside, yep, that's a bunch of math. You can read up on this node if you Google for it, but I'm not going to try to explain it all. At least, not the math, I'm just going to explain how to use it. Basically what this node is originally meant for is calibrating a value change between an input and an output. So right now you see our in low is 0 and our in high is 1, and our out low is 0 and out high is 1. This means we're taking a I guess, an image that goes from black to white and mapping it from black to white. So right now this isn't actually doing anything because our input does start at black and it goes about to white with our current light brightness. So I'll leave that as it is, but we could use this to tell it that the output is actually darker. So now, as I turn this down, it darkens things up. And that's because now the brightest point is now 0.3, and it's rescaled the values from, instead of 0 to 1, it's now 0 to 0.3 as a gradient between those two numbers. Now I can leave that way, and I can actually tell it that the input is weaker than it thought. So now, since it thinks that white in the input is now only 0.5, and so it scaled it up and actually brightened up our white areas. So effectively, we can use the in high to brighten our lights, and the in low to darken our blacks. And as we bring these numbers closer to each other, well, that looks a lot like the color ramp toon shader, doesn't it? In fact, it is. It's exactly the same. This is basically a mathematical version of that color ramp with those two stops. We'll bring that back so you can see. This is almost a direct correspondence to these two stops, the in and the out. Now, the advantage of the color ramp node is that you can add more stops and have more control, and with the rescale you cannot, but rescale works with parameters. So it's actually pretty friendly to what we want. So the rest of this shader we will be building up with this rescale node method. So now we have a very basic toon shader, and we can set up more parameters to make it easier to work with, look better, and all those important things. But before we go that far, let's take another couple minutes on theory and understand how our lights are affecting everything. Since our toon shader works by ramping a gradient of light from black to white, what exactly our lights give us in terms of that is quite important. We'll switch back to just the plain diffuse shader so we can see exactly what the lights are doing. So the lights have a couple parameters we care about in this case. Of course, the color, we want to be pure white in this case. And the strength is going to affect how much of the model is lit. Turned up that high, we see our white area actually extends from here all the way to about there, and then we get a gradient to the unlit area. So the higher our power, the smaller our gradient. So turning up our light strength is actually giving us a very similar effect to what we were getting from ramping the shading. You could effectively make a toon shader just by using extremely overbright lights all the time, but that's not ideal because then you can't have any non-toon shaders in your setup either. So it's better to use normal looking light and then only affect some of it in the shader. Another parameter that matters is angle, or the size on a point light. And they work basically the same way. Right now we're at angle 0, which is pretty unrealistic, and you'll almost never use it except for toon shading. But if we turn it up, we got a larger lit area. We can go even higher. We can go all the way 80. I think if we go to 180, it bounces back. I'm not sure what happens when we go to, say, 120. Yeah, that's pretty big. And this represents the light being larger and thus able to illuminate more of the model. And it's effectively increasing the size of our gradient area. So basically you want to pick an angle setting and then calibrate your shader for it. In fact, you want to pick light settings in general. And that's one of the current limitations in Eevee right now, and why we prefer a sun lamp over the point light. Because again, with the sun lamp we get consistent lighting, whereas with the point light, it is dependent on the distance from the object. So we can have strong lighting on our close-up objects, and then it's weaker on further away. So after we ramp it, it's going to be a large toon area on the close-up objects and a small on the large, or on the far-off objects. Turning up the radius makes the light, oh, that's a bit much, makes the light bigger, but also weaker. If you turn up the radius, you also need to turn up the power. If you double the radius, double the power. And I actually quadrupled the radius or so. So now it's hitting a bigger area, but you see it's almost completely blowing out the close object, and it's getting more of the further away object, but it's also quite strong. So it's really not ideal. These objects are fairly large, they're the default scales, but you can imagine if you're trying to light a room with this, and you had, say, multiple lamps that were using point lights, it would get rather messy, especially when positioning multiple characters. So if you're just doing a studio setup where you have one key light, it works well with the sun, but complex scenes aren't going to work too well with this toon shader, and they don't work too well in any toon shader setup in Eevee at the moment. And there's another reason for that, which I'll show you next. The issue comes from the fact that Eevee's toon shaders are not real toon shaders. They're regular shaders that we're then ramping into looking like toon shaders, but they work a bit differently from the real thing. Let's take a look at the Cycles toon shader for comparison. I'm going to switch us back to the sunlight and leave its size, angle quite low. In 2.79 this was called size. And let's hook that back up and hop over to Cycles. We don't need to change a whole lot, which is great. Now straight away you can see that we have a major shading problem, even with just the regular diffuse shader, which is this horrible jaggedness. And that is a result of that very small size in Cycles. If we turn up the angle, it goes away and it softens everything out. So that's one of the major downsides of using Cycles for toon shading at all, is you have what's known as the Terminator problem. You can get that with point lights too, it's just easier with sunlights. But let's add a Cycles toon shader and set our sun back to 0 and see what that looks like. Make sure we turn it up to pure white to keep our comparisons the same. So the Cycles toon shader has two parameters. It has the size, which as we turn up increases the size of the lit area. But if we go too high, here comes that jagged Terminator again. But if we stay at 0.9 or below, we don't run into it. So when using the Cycles toon BSDF, you just never go above size 0.9. So the size controls how large the lit area is, and then the smooth sort of bevels that hard gradient, which looks a lot like our ramped or linear color ramp or rescale gradient we were making. So it's basically the same sort of effect we're getting. Now what's important to know, of course, is as I turn this up, you can see that the shadowed area is getting smaller. And that means the total size of the shader area is actually going to be the size plus the smooth. And you see, if I set the size up and then turn the smooth up, here comes that jaggedness. So you have to make sure that your total size and smooth don't go over, say, 0.95 added together. And that's another just general Cycles toon rule. But we're not going to have to worry about that in Eevee at all. But there is something we will have to worry about from Cycles. So, as I said, the size setting controls how big our lit area is. And if we adjust our light strength, if we turn it down, the lit area stayed the same size, but the intensity of the light got weaker, which is about what you'd expect. And that means if you have a light source, like even the point light, then it's going to stay fairly consistent, even with the different distances. No, can't go that low. So that's pretty good. That's generally how you'd want things to behave artistically, especially if you're trying to do more complicated scenes. So the lit area is the intensity of the lit area is brighter on the closer up objects, but the overall size of the lit area is about the same. Now let's go back to Eevee and remember how it works there. Oh my. The lit area on the close objects is around the same, but on the further away objects it's tiny now. That's odd. Well, that's because, remember, we are picking a point on the gradient of light and saying this is where our hard-edged Terminator is. So it's totally dependent on the brightness of the light. So if we turn down our light strength, our shaded area gets smaller, but stays the same brightness. It's still going nearly to pure white. And if we turn it up, it gets bigger and brighter. I think we're just blowing it out at this point. So in cycles, when you change the light strength, it changes the intensity of the lit area, but not the size. And in Eevee, when you change the light strength, it changes the size of the lit area, but not the intensity. And that means that you have a major problem as soon as you're using uneven amounts of light or complex scenes. And this is the main reason that I say Eevee doesn't really have a real toon shader, because a real toon shader would act more like the Cycles one. I'm hoping that in the future we'll get a port of the Cycles toon shader to Eevee, but I have no idea how high a priority that is for the devs. I hope that someone will put something through eventually, because until then, we're stuck manually correcting for these size differences. Okay, so now we understand what's going on with light. But there's another technical thing we need to know before we move on here, and that's to understand what's going on with shadows in Eevee. So far, I've actually had them disabled. My lights have had this box unchecked. But let's make sure that they are enabled in the global setting, soft shadows, and in the light, let's turn them on. And what is going on? Well, what's going on is that Eevee is a real-time engine that has to do a lot of tricks to realistically calculate occlusion-based shadows. So simple occlusion shadows is right now this is being cast by the sphere because our light angle is actually coming in that way. And so the sphere is shadowing this monkey, and it doesn't look that great. It kind of takes it a second to resolve. And then if I turn on contact shadows, which picks up even smaller shadows cast within objects, that makes it even worse. Let's look at this at just the regular diffuse shader so we can really see what's going on. Now, these are settings we control on the lights. And we've got various parameters to control them, but So basically, cast shadows or occlusion shadows or whatever you want to call them like this are an ongoing problem in Eevee. And in 2.81, they're actually making several major changes to how they're computed. So I'm not going to go into them in detail, partly because I don't really understand it all, and partly because they're changing it and hopefully improving it. But the important thing to know is just that they're kind of wacky and not that great, and it's just something you have to live with at the moment if you want to use Eevee. I'm working on figuring out a way to recomposite them in from cycles, since I render both versions anyway. If I can render nice cast shadows in cycles, I will just use those. But that is a problem for a later tutorial. However, since this workflow is very flexible, it is an option to do that, and that's the important thing to remember. So, going ahead, I'm just going to leave this off, and we're just not going to worry about that right now. And hopefully by the time you're watching this, whenever that is, that this is just a fixed issue and you never have to think about it. But, yeah, that's just how it is right now. Now that we know how this is all working, we can actually start setting up our nodes. I'm going to do a long-form description of what every node and parameter does, so it's going to take a while. If you're experienced with nodes already, you may want to skip ahead or set the video to play at double speed or something like that. For starters, we're going to throw everything into a group. This will be the overall Eevee group, and name it Eevee Toon Shader. Set it to save. Within this group, each major component will be its own subgroup. So the diffuse shading will go to its own group, as we'll be adding some more to that. And then a second group will be the hardening of that shading into a toon shader. Because as you may remember, we have both a soft and hard shader. So group that. And group that. And now we can start fleshing these out more. We'll start with the Toon Harden group. The main controls we're going to want over our Toon shader are the size and smooth, just like on the Cycle shader, which is convenient because we also want them to share the same group inputs. So we want size and smooth, and we want them to be roughly corresponding in how they work. So what exactly on this rescale is controlling our size? We can see that if we adjust in low, that's controlling basically where the black comes to, and in high is controlling where the white comes to, with the difference between being the size of the gradient. So effectively our smooth. And if we set them to be the same, then it just turns black. And if high goes below low, it inverts. So we never want it to be the same, and we never want it to go below it. So let's say this will be our size and this our smooth. The easiest way to do this is simply to have smooth be an amount added on top of size. And we'll keep that at a small number, which is about corresponding to the values used in the Cycle shader as well. So that will work just fine. And as long as we have the right amount of light level going in, then we may be able to get the terminator size on this shader to exactly match the Cycle shader with this method. There, one value is changing the amount of darkness, but the size of that smoothed area is staying the same, regardless of what this is set at. Now, as I said, we don't want this to hit 0, because then it gets screwed up. But note, even I use the arrows on the node, but if I click into it, it's not actually 0, so you have to watch out for that. But we can use more math to make sure it never truly goes to 0. There's a couple ways of doing this, but this will do. Set that to be maybe 0.03. And now, even if this is 0, this is making it so that, regardless of what's coming in the second socket, it will always be a minimum of at least 0.03. If you make it a bit lower, then you can eliminate even more of the gradient, but then that will give you aliasing on your edges. Now, the only other discrepancy from the Cycle shader now is currently larger values in the size means a smaller lit area, whereas in the Cycle shader it is the opposite. So let's go ahead and invert this. And note in Eevee, the invert node doesn't always update, so if you mute and unmute, then it'll recompile the shader and work. I don't know why that node particularly doesn't necessarily update when you add it, but that will probably be fixed at some point. Alright, so there's the basics. We've got our size and smooth. Okay, I cleaned up the group during the cut and added some frames and set up the proper inputs. Now let's keep building more features. Another control we're going to want is a way to adjust the amount of brightness of our mask so that we can compensate for different levels of light coming in. This is again something we want to do because we're in this strange situation of ramping the shaders. So I've turned my sun lamp way down, and now our shading is not very good anymore. It's gotten tiny. But let's just add another rescale node and fix that. If we look at the raw shading, we can see that the problem is that it's only going to a mid-gray now. It's just not bright enough. But we can adjust the in high and make it think that that is white now. And now that has basically fixed the light and undone turning our sun lamp down. We can adjust that even more. So that's just a handy control to have to compensate for a low light. And we'll go ahead and add an input for that as well. Now just a quick tip. Anytime you're adding an input on a group, the quickest way to do it is to use it off the FAQ of a mix node, because it will autofill the various parameters of your input, like the default value and the minimum and maximum, based on what you use as a source. So I want this to default to 1, add that. Now if I look at this FAQ, it's already given the same min and max. And now we'll just call it white level. Up. Okay, moving on. Should plug that in. Set that back to 1 and turn our light back up to 4 where it started. That's just a bonus control if we need it, but we don't in our current setup. Now let's make it so we can mix our original shading back in, which you may remember I have in my existing version of this shader in my character file. That's an easy thing to do. We'll just take the regular shading, the toon shading, and multiply the non-toon shading back over it. And there it is. We can adjust it with this fac. That doesn't look quite right. The shading should look like that. So why, when we're multiplying this, isn't this area darker? Well, the reason is that this value here is not clamped. This node is outputting, the white is actually a higher value than 1, so it's clipping. Now, in the 2.81 version of this node group, there is a checkbox on it to clamp the value, but that doesn't exist in this particular version of the group, so let's go ahead and add that. You can easily add a clamp by just using a mix node set to 1, set this in the second socket, so it's not actually doing anything except, there we go, clamped. And now we can see that this is working properly. The last thing we'll need in this group is a way to disable the toon shading entirely. We can make it so that there's only toon shading and no soft shading right now, but what if we want only soft shading? I'm not sure where that would come up, but let's build as many controls we might want later so that we can actually do look development with this. So to do that, we could just use a mix node and mix this back with the regular shading based on a new input, but that means adding even more inputs. It would be nice if we could use an existing one and have that control whether there's toon shading or not, and we can. So first let's make a mix between this combined shading we have now and the original shading. So there we go. And what we'll control that with is actually the toon size. Let's add a greater than math node. Set it to be greater than 0. So if the size is more than 0, then we will get the combined shading. And if the size is 0 or less, then we will get only the original untuned shading. If we tab out of our group and test that now, you can see as we turn down the size, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and oh, it's not true 0, set that to be 0, and there we go. You can solve that problem of the arrows not letting you go to true 0 on the inputs at least by setting the minimum to 0. We should have that on all of these. Alright, now we have pretty good controls overall. We can adjust our size, we can adjust our brightness effectively, and we can adjust our smooth amount. Oh yeah, we should add a fac for this soft shading too, shouldn't we? There we go. That gives us a pretty good amount of controls. Cover most cases. So that means we're done with this group. It's time to move on. Now we've got our regular shading and our tuned shading. So we could move on and do color or gloss next, but before we do, let's actually go back and make our regular shading a bit more interesting and set up its controls. Since we're doing NPR shading, part of the fun of that is doing, well, less realistic stuff. So let's have some fun and add some ambient occlusion into this shader. If we look at it on its own, and plug that all the way to our output, we can see that it is darkening crevices, as AO does, and with distance, we can change how much it does it, except, as I said earlier, the controls on the node itself don't actually work right in Eevee. They do in cycles, but in Eevee it's actually controlled here in the main render tab, and you have the same value for all of your AO everywhere. So I guess that's kind of handy. You have less options, but that's just one of the compromises you make when working with Eevee. Not a big deal though. So let's go ahead and take that, and since we're using shader.rgb anyway, we just get to freely mix and match colors. I'm going to set that to a darken. And now it is going to be at least as dark in our AO. So it's a subtle effect. We could use multiply if we wanted it to be more aggressive, but that means the AO will, well, it'll be stronger. We can toggle this to see how much of a difference it's making. Not a huge visible difference on these models because there aren't a whole lot of hard edges, but depending on your model, you'll see this do more. It's fine to have subtle effects. Now, if we have this on darken, note that there's something a bit weird with the FAC on darken. I think this started in 2.8. It might be a bug. Maybe this will be fixed by the time you're watching this, but instead of reducing the darkening effect, it's just darkening everything to black. So for now, we'll work around that. We do want to have an AO FAC, but we'll do it a different way. We'll just set up a new mix node, and instead of controlling the strength of the darken, we'll just control the strength of the AO that is doing the darkening. So by controlling its mix with white. So there you go. And we'll clean that up in a minute. So that's one feature we want. Now another thing that's fun to do actually is, what you'll notice is this is a pretty linear gradient, as we've talked about with our shading. But what if we wanted an effect where the places being hit by the light were being hit a little harder? We could achieve that with math, but another easy way to achieve it is actually to just cheat a bit with shaders. Let's add a glossy and see what that looks like. There we go. That's going to hotspot the more lit areas, and of course we can rough that up to control it, or adjust the color to control how much of it there is. So I'm going to take this gloss and I'm going to add it to our existing shading. And what this is basically doing is saying that our current, it'll make it so we can't get any shading in areas that can pick up a glossy highlight. That made something unhappy. Ah, yes. I'm going to need to run this through a shader to RGB too, of course. That purple is not just for broken textures, it also is what happens when you plug a shader into a color slot. There we go. Now we can see the effect of this is it's brightening up our brights even more, which is just changing the character of our shading. It's exposing our exposed surfaces even more, and making sure that they're going to make it quite a bit of the way to white. And the amount of that is controlled with this, with the roughness, effectively. So you may or may not want these features. You can always come and delete these nodes. But I do want this to be affected by the overall controls. So when we get to gloss later, we'll be talking about this more, but one thing that you often use to mix your diffuse and your gloss is Fresnel, or layer. I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the uses of this. I'm using a custom group version of it that has a few more controls. Here's a look inside, if you want to understand that. This is making it so that, effectively, it has roughness, which the Fresnel node does not normally have, and this is a fix to make it so that it doesn't give you the wrong results when looking at back faces. So what I'm going to do is actually take this Fresnel and add it to my gloss. Well, I should say add my gloss to black based on it. Let's see what that's doing. So this has changed the character of the gloss shading again. Now it is being influenced by the index of refraction of the object, which is going to be a global setting in the group that will be controlling how shiny the object is. Again, this is totally a stylistic choice I'm making, so for different styles you may not want this effect or not. Now let's set up the group inputs and some labels, but I'll do that during the cut. And there we go. That gives us our basic inputs and controls. Alright, let's move on. Color is much easier to set up than shading. Let's get some color to start with. There's nice blue. And then to make it affected by the shading, we will use a multiply. The color, the object is blue all over, but then darkened based on the shading. And if the shading didn't go all the way to black, such as if we had some ambient light, which we'll be setting up next, then it would look more like this, and the dark areas, instead of being a pure black, would just be a dark blue. If we turn down the color, the whole thing will get darker, of course. This is about the same sort of color math that we have when combining cycles passes. And of course, one of the main points of a NPR shader is to be able to put different colors in the lights and the shadows. This is the main thing that cycles cannot do. If cycles could, we wouldn't be here. We'd just be happily using cycles. But it can't because of the way it works. That's the price for realistic lighting. So there we go. Our shading mask is alternating between two colors, and then we get the darkening in the shadows as well. So that works pretty well, but there are some issues, like if I darken this red, then my lights are now dead. So I want to tint the shading, but I don't actually want the value of the color changing my shading too much, because I'm already getting the value from the shading mask. So let's get some controls to bring that in line, and I actually already have them in a group. So instead of mixing with this mix node, let's swap in this group. And for starters, we have just the blue, and our shading, our shadows are dark. So at the moment, this second slot isn't doing anything because of controls in the group. But we can plug red in, and now it is doing something. So let's take a look inside this group and see what it's doing, as it's doing several things that matter. First of all, we're using that greater than trick again. If the override color is pure black, then it just passes the regular color through the group, and nothing happens. Second, the main feature of this group is if I go up my blue here and I change the value, it changes the color darker. But if I change the value on the shadow color, nothing happens. Let's go all the way to 0, I guess, and then it reverts back to the blue. And the reason for that is this second part of the group, where it is taking the value from the primary color and replacing the value of the override color with that. So the value of the color is totally set by the primary color, and the override color's value makes no difference. Only its hue and saturation matters. And then lastly, we have the mask factor, like our original mix node. So that's what this group is for. It means that we can easily try out different colors in our shadows without it actually screwing up our values. And that's especially useful because a lot of the time the sort of setup you'll be using is taking the primary color and putting it through something like an HSV node. And then making changes to it this way. In this case, you could just leave the value socket alone, but if you want to be able to use an RGB node like we originally had and have it not give you problems, or you may want to even use some other method of blending your colors, then this node just stops you from screwing it up. And you may feel like you don't need this in the setup, but it doesn't hurt to have. Well, it may hurt our node compile times a little bit. The nodes are reorganized, so it's time to bring in ambient or world lighting. Normally that's done with the surface or world tab. Let's take a look at what that regularly does with the normal diffuse node. It's black right now, so it's not going to do much. Let's turn it up to white, and let's set our background to not be transparent so we can actually see it. That's it in the background. As we turn it up, there it is. It's now about 0.1 because the strength is a multiplier on the color. And it's lightening up the unlit parts of our image because it's just light coming in from every angle. The light parts of our image get lighter, but they're all blowing out to white. And if we change the world color, then it's going to tint everything to that color. The areas that are already white aren't going to get more white because this is additional light being added on top, and if you add anything to white, it's still white. We can also change the color on the diffuser itself, which will be kind of blending the two colors, but notice how much that's darkening up as I go towards a full red or a full blue, or even going in the same green direction is darkening it a little bit. And that's because, of course, these values are actually going down. White is 1, 1, 1, and going towards any of these colors away from white is actually a darker value. So that's to be expected. But of course, we can keep turning the strength up above 1 because it's not a FAC, it's a light strength. And that will slowly brighten everything up. It just takes a lot of strength. It doesn't always update. It's a little bit weird, like, if I move the color off slightly, then suddenly all that light strength is there. So I don't really understand exactly what the deal is with the math behind the world lighting in color, but it's fine, just don't use really wacky colors or values, and it's not really an issue. So, questionable as it may be, we are going to recreate it in a way that interacts with our shader properly, because right now, this doesn't. And that's because, of course, all of this world light is taking effect on in the shader node itself, and that means it's happening before all our ramping, and it's messing up our clean black and white light that we need for all of this earlier stuff to work properly. Because once again, this is not a real Toon shader. This is a workaround. This is a hack, a kludge, doing a jury rig, doing the best we can with what we've got. So, essentially, for our shader to work, we need the world to be black and not influence anything, but we're going to recreate it in nodes. So to do that, we're going to need a color and a strength. And then, as I mentioned, the color is a multiplier, or the strength multiplies the color, although, it's the same thing. And then we're going to take our shading here and use our shading mask to control where the world color shows up. So the shading mask is actually going to be the FAC between the world color and white. And now, if I adjust things, this looks a lot like what we just saw with that diffuse node. And then, of course, we can bring in our material color, and there it is, same strange behavior. We have recreated the behavior quite easily. But of course, the real world is staying black all the time, which in general we won't care about because most people are just going to have that set to transparent and composite in some other scene or image there. But just in case you are the sort of person who does use the world, let's make it so that doesn't totally break. Because we can throw these parameters into a group and then add that to the world material nodes as well, which I've already set up. Here's a world group, which is these 3 nodes. So let's delete those and plug that in instead. The multiply is happening inside the group now. And just the same, if we set our colors here, and then go over to the world nodes, and here, this is what we were using before. Whatever background node is plugged in shows up here. So let's plug in this other stack, and now our world is back. And it hasn't messed up our shading because of this little trick. We have 2 background nodes, one being fed by our group, and the other one is pure black. If I make this so it's not pure black, then it does mess everything up, so we'll leave that. What's going on here is we're using a light path to cheat. We're using isCameraRay, and what this means is that which of these background nodes gets, which one you see and which one gets used depends on the camera. So if the camera is looking at it like the background, then it's going to use this second one, because that will be an output of 1. But if it is light that is affecting something else but isn't directly going to the camera, so light illuminating another object, then it uses this one, which is black, so nothing happens. That's a nice little workaround. There we go. It is finally time to get some gloss in here. That's right, the shading, the diffuse effectively, is finished. Let's move down and add a gloss. And there it is. And we could, if we want hard gloss shading, we just follow the same process, but I don't actually, because gloss gets plenty hard on its own if you just use low roughness, so I just don't think it's really necessary. So we can just take our gloss, and we can still convert it to color, and then get a mix, and mix it in at some appropriate factor of shininess. And there you go, that's gloss. It can be that simple if you want it to be, or we can make it more complicated, which I will. And that's because I'm actually going to leave the shader that simple, but I want to be able to change its color, just like this, and how we mix it with the diffuse actually matters quite a bit for how it's going to look. What we have right now is just a flat mix rate, which means it's going to look fairly flat. It's just a percentage of what our gloss is giving us is appearing on the model. And that's not the wrong way to do it, but it's not the only way to do it. Now, those of you who have done any sort of photorealism in Cycles will know that the usual way you combine diffuse and gloss is with Fresnel or layer weight. And so we're going to look into that. Now, what Fresnel does is it gives us an output based on an index of refraction. And the output looks about like that. Or we can use layer weight, which also gives us an output that looks about like that, which if I adjust it, you'll realize is actually roughly the same sort of thing. They're both light on the edges and dark in the middle. And how dark is going to depend on these various settings. And this can give you facing or Fresnel. So we would use the Fresnel from the facing node because it's a different mathematical model. So the difference between the Fresnel output on the layer weight and the Fresnel node itself is whether you're working with a blend, which is just a value between 0 and 1 with a totally arbitrary value, or if you're using an index of refraction. And IORs are real values from the real world. So blend is 0 to 1. IOR is generally 1 and a higher, except in a few weird circumstances. So I'm not going to do a full lecture on how Fresnel works and what these indexes of refraction means, but the basic idea of Fresnel is that things get more shiny at glancing angles. You'll notice this if you look down at your desk, put your head near desk level, your desk will look shinier than if you look straight down at it. Or if you are ever looking into a puddle, if you look straight down to the puddle, then you'll see straight through to the bottom. And if you put your head near the ground and look at a glancing angle, it will look shiny like a mirror. And also, mirages on roadways, all sorts of effects are caused by Fresnel. It's a normal part of photorealism, and you wouldn't normally find it in non-photorealism, but I'm putting it in just because I like the way it looks. So these indexes of refraction are real measured values. For example, steel is 2.5. And the only other ones I remember are funky ones, like chrome, which is 1.8, and metallic gold is 0.47. And remember, these are masks that we're going to use to mix our diffuse and gloss. So let's plug these in. Default is going to look like that. I'll wait for it to build now. So we see it's shinier on the edges. which makes it great for picking up like rim light and stuff like that. So if we go up to higher values and get into metallics range, like 2.5 for steel, it's pretty damn shiny. And if we go to that weird range, well, that does look kind of chromy. It's going to be a bit funky with these tuned materials, because normally in a true metallic, you use the gloss color to determine what the material color is, and the diffuse color would actually be black. So if this was a proper gold, that is actually starting to look kind of like metallic gold, but this shader is too simple to fully capture all of it. You need cycles to really do this justice. But as I've said before, I intend to use the same parameters to control this Eevee shader and cycles. So I am going to mix these with the index of refraction. But I'm not going to use this Fresnel node. I'm going to use that group I showed much earlier, which is a Fresnel node with some bug fixes. As I said before, I got this part of the group from some tutorial. I'm afraid I don't remember who to attribute it to. But this adds roughness, and this I added. Fresnel gets messed up on back faces, so it needs to be inverted on back faces to behave correctly, so that's what's going on here. I recommend having this group in general. So we'll mix our diffuse and gloss with that. And then when we set up group controls, we'll use the same roughness and normal that we have elsewhere in the group. But for now, rough numbers to know. 1 will give you no shininess at all, and then as you move up, it'll get shinier and shinier. I think 1.333 is human skin and hair. Not that that really applies for a Toon material, but it's just fun trivia. But the point is, higher is shinier, and then if you want really funky metallics, then you go below 1. That's the real thing to understand here. If you don't like Fresnel, you can just replace this with a flat factor. Or there are even groups that convert an index of refraction number to flat factors if you like indexes of refraction as a way of visualizing how shiny you want things to be rather than just a number between 0 and 1. So there's lots of ways you can structure this. But that's just my personal preference because I come from working with cycles. I'm going to pause now and set up more nodes and a color override for the gloss as well. And there we go, nice and cleaned up. So the gloss has been given the same setup where it gets color, it has a color override, currently between white in the lit parts and kind of a yellow elsewhere, which lets us do all sorts of funky looking things. And it's being affected by the world in exactly the same way. So if I adjust the world strength, it's going to brighten up. And if I remove it, it's going to go down. So all caught up, it's combined with the diffuse, but there's actually something else strange I'm going to do and make this even weirder. And that is because right now, this is not in a good setup for exporting to other programs to paint on. And that's partly because of the way I'm combining the diffuse and gloss. So imagine that I want to take this into Krita, which I will. That's part of the point of this whole setup, is to make it easy to export. And I want to have a separate diffuse layer and a separate gloss layer and work on them there and then combine them conveniently. At the moment, I need the Fresnel mask to combine them. So right now I'd have to export that as a third layer. So if I can change my setup so that I don't need the Fresnel mask, if I can essentially combine it into these layers instead of using it as a mix, and then combine the layers in a more straightforward way that I can do in third-party programs, then that would be better. And we can do that, which is why I'm talking about it, and it would go like this. Instead of mixing them based on Fresnel, I'm essentially going to subtract the Fresnel from each of them. And I'm not sure exactly if subtraction would be the right math, but it's going to look like this. the same down here, but the other way around. Socket 2 instead of 1. And now we'll just add them, which you can do in other programs. Or you could use screen or something, it wouldn't really matter. And there we go. That looks the same as it did before, doesn't it? Let's double check. Let's restore the old setup momentarily. And be able to mix between the two. Our node's finished recompiling, and I shouldn't see any difference when I scrub this now. And I don't. So it worked. Let's get rid of that. And there we go. Diffuse and gloss finished. The last major component of the shader is the specular pass. Well, I'm calling it specular, but that doesn't really mean much. It's actually going to be the rim light boost. I'm just calling it specular because it is going to be bright white and our other gloss can be other colors. I've gone ahead and made a backlight. It is this old point light repurposed. You can see we have a little bit of backlighting from the use of Fresnel because of our world light. I'm going to turn our world off entirely so that we can see this better. So that's just the backlighting we're getting on the regular shader. And with the sun lamp on, you can see that there. Now we want to make that go totally crazy. But we only want to have it go crazy in a restricted area that we can control. So let's add another glossy shader. Make sure it's all the way up to white. And that's picking up a lot more of the backlight, isn't it? But it's also picking up our key light. How do we stop that? Let's limit it with a layer weight. We looked at this before. This gives us a gradient based on the normal facing. Facing away more is closer to white. So if we plug that in there and ramp it, and by ramp I mean brighten contrast, now it's giving us a very narrow mask of the edge. And we can make it even more extreme by adjusting this more or less. And we can control the size of it with the blend amount. We'll be making that a group input, of course. So let's stick a value node there. And that's pretty much it. Super rim light. We'll convert it and add it in. There we go, super boosted rim light without messing with the rest of our setup. There is one issue with the rim light though. Not in the setup, but in the light settings. If we look here, we can see it's getting rim light on edges here, which it shouldn't be. The light is coming from behind. You see the rim light's position, it's way back there. So this it should be getting blocked by the monkey. But if you recall, we don't have shadows enabled. So the light is actually passing through the monkey and hitting here. So let's turn those on. And that does away with most of it. Now, if we turn contact shadows on, that may do away with a bit more of it in some areas. Might as well leave it on because it's giving us some artifacting there. But we're still getting a bit of it like in this inner ear part, which is just odd. And that's another problem with Eevee. The light is bleeding through. It's connected to the whole shadow issue I talked about before. So hopefully it goes away when that goes away. But for the time being, we'd have to manually mask or erase these out of the pass somehow, or I'm not sure. Maybe some combination of these settings will deal with it. But that will have to be covered another time. That is beyond the scope of this tutorial, but hopefully this has been fixed by the time you're watching this. I've upgraded the group to be a proper group and have its own inputs and outputs, and I've given each object its own material. I also expanded what used to be the world group into a full palette for this scene, so that I can adjust all the different diffuse colors as well as the world color and settings from the same place. We could add more settings in here if we wanted to. Each object has been given some different settings just to get a different look. Inside this group is our main shader, which is actually nested as its own group. And that's because I want some of the parameters of the shader to be global effectively. If I change this, it changes on all the objects. And then other parameters, of course, are by the individual materials. We also have lots of outputs. Before, I was always running the shader as just a color output and plugging it into the output node. And that does work in Eevee most of the time. I've had times where it doesn't work, so I'm not actually sure if you're supposed to do that. But I did want a proper shader output socket in case we wanted to take the output of a group and mix it with other shaders or something in a given material. So we have both a shader version and just the color output, and then outputs of our individual masks. That way, if you're out in the main group, you can pull just one of these other outputs and look at only one part of the shader at any given time. I've used lots of different group inputs across the node graph because we don't want to have to pipe everything from the same input, but we do have to pipe everything to only one output, which is kind of annoying, but that's just how it is. So we get to have a lot of lines everywhere. A few other notes. I'm not plugging the roughness into the Fresnel mix because the roughness does impact how shiny things are quite a lot, and I want a lot of shininess in the shader mix. So that is, again, an artistic choice. Different people may want to plug that in if you want really rough objects to have very little shininess. And the other thing is this shadeless group. You could just use a regular emission node in Eevee. I'm just using this because I'm used to using this in my cycles setup. In cycles, if you just use an emission node and you have other lighting going on, then, well, if you have other objects, then your object you want to be shadeless will actually be a light source and get light on everything else. So once again, this is using the is camera ray trick we learned earlier for the world light to make it so that in cycles this won't cast any light and will reflect as if it was a colored diffuse. So not important for Eevee, but good thing to know in general, and it doesn't hurt to use it. There are some more controls and things we may add to this group later, but this is enough for now to move on to the last major subject of this tutorial. We've come a long way so far. We've learned about how toon shading in Eevee works conceptually, and we've gone through building up a big fancy toon shader. And for the third major topic of this tutorial, we are now going to talk about the sort of workflow options and features we can add to this to make it even more powerful. The nature of NPR and comics and all stylized art styles in general is that there are a lot of exceptions to rules. So it's very difficult to build a shader that will cover all of your use cases. There's a lot of ways that people have come to draw different styles over the years, and if you're trying to mimic them, you may find that you can copy part of it, but there'll always be a few tiny things that aren't right. You'll often have your shader will work for 95% of a style or an image, and then there's just a few things that need totally different stuff because they follow different rules. Add to that the problems of 3D in general. It tends to be too perfect and you're very much attached to your topology. You could have topology that is right for your diffuse, but then it doesn't look right for the gloss. So what are you going to do? Render your diffuse off one model and your gloss off another? That's a bit too much to ask. Some of these issues we can get around by basically using a different shader on only a small part of a piece, And for a lot of them, the easiest way to solve it is actually just to draw that area by hand, or to make very minor adjustments or erase small parts. So a big part of why we built this shader in this way is to make it possible to do basically anything we want at any point. And if you think about it, what we have here is some nodes that are generating our passes, and then almost all of this is actually just processing and then combining those passes. This is almost more like a compositor than a material at this point. And that's essentially how we're going to think about it from now on. This is our image stack, similar to what you'd have in a painting program, but laid out in nodes. So if we want to change something in this stack, we can add masks or more layers in between in this area. We're going to go through a couple ways that you can do that. The first trick we can do is simply adding or subtracting things to our existing passes. Since they're just black and white masks, that is really easy to do. You can grab an add, drop that in there, and say we wanted our shadows to not just be pure black, but to have some texture to them. There you go. Now our shading mask has texture. This could be a hatching texture, or I could turn down the factor of this to get maybe a bit of a paper look, or, you know, sky's the limit really, whatever you want. So we can stick things directly in, or of course we could be subtracting this instead. I can find it. And get a different effect. Now that's knocking it out of the lights instead of out of the darks. That's one option. If we want even more creative control, we could go further and use a hand-drawn texture. Since this is Eevee and it has good performance, you can actually texture paint right in it. Let's set up a new image texture. Make it nice and big. And I'm going to make this so that it does two things. I want to be able to use the same texture to control both addition and subtraction from this mask. So I'm going to separate RGB and make it so that red adds and blue subtracts. Now let's go into texture paint mode. Our brush here. I'm going to set this to be red for add, and then my secondary color to be blue, and the hotkey X switches in between. So if I'm painting red, it's going to erase my existing shading. And if I switch and paint blue, it's going to add it back in a different area. And let's get really fancy. That back up. Gotta wait for the recompile now, unfortunately. We can be working on our shading with all our colors and the rest of our stack running. Let's see. I think I don't like that little spot on the ear, so it's gone. And this is a bit too smoothed out, so let's just get rid of some of that. Of course, this is just an example. I need to plug in my tablet to do this properly. But anyone who's tried to do a bunch of toon shaders knows what it's like to have something just be slightly off and having no way to get at it and fix it. That's a bit more shading there. Maybe that should be occluded. And right now, I have the same UVs on everything, so it looks wrong on all the other monkeys. But the way around that would be to be projecting this from camera instead. So let's try that. Shut this off for a second. Let's get a totally new texture. And this time for the UVs, I already have a projected texture, UV unwrap, from this camera. That's UV projected with projection from bounds. And since this is in my group, this is actually shared on all of these at the moment. Oh, I need to move to the correct image. There we go. So I could actually bounce over to a different monkey, move into texture paint, and as long as I'm on the right image, then that still works. Let's get rid of that. So in a real artistic setting, this gives you a lot of power, and of course you can add this for all the other passes or any parts of a pass you want. And you can, of course, change up the group to get at different areas too. Right now I'm painting this on all the shading, but I could split this up and have it only affect the hardened toon and not the regular shading, or have it only affect the AO, or whatever you want. And of course, we can set up groups for this too and pass them to group inputs, which we will do. A second way we can interact with these passes is by overriding them entirely. Let's take our shading mask and render it out. And now I'm going to save that and open it in another program. Here it is opened up in Krita. And then I will do some editing on it here. Let's just draw a big visible line through everything. You know, I'll do my whatever shadow editing or paint over or whatever I need here. Then I will save that again. And come back to Blender. Other one. Open it up as its own image. And then simply project it. You can project it based on project from bounds, or the easier way is often to use the window projection because it's an image the same size as the camera. And there we go. That's just totally replaced our shading mask. So if I was working on a complex art piece, then I could be basically taking out one pass of the image that I needed, working on it in post, and then bringing it back in here, rather than in old setups, I'd have to render every single pass out and fully recombine all the passes in the other program to be able to see what I was doing. Now, as Blender gets more painting upgrades, which I think we're expecting as maybe in 2.82, then we may be able to do multi-layer regular painting just in Blender itself, which would be great. So I can have that, and I could set up controls to be able to have this be a globally applied, or to only apply to certain materials. I can mix it back in with the original. I could save this, then change parameters on the original and have a second layer without running 2 copies of the nodes. There's tons of possibilities when we can do this. Our Eevee shader has received its final upgrade and reorganization. Behold it in all its glory. This time I've added node groups and controls for injections and overrides. I'm calling the process of adding or subtracting from an existing pass a injection, or if you're just replacing it entirely, that's an override. We've got groups to inject or override the diffuse, gloss, and specular, although you could add them for literally anywhere. And then also some controls here at the end to let you make something purely shadeless if it's an emission material, multiply something to make it pure black if you're adding in, say, a line art texture, or to override the entire image with a different input. And of course, all of these can be done at either the global level, if you do it here, or on a per material basis. Let's take a look at how this works. In our injection group, it's mostly just a bunch of adds. So this is the same thing I showed earlier, where R is add and B is going to be subtract. So if you're painting a texture, you'd plug it in the top. Or we have more addition and subtraction here. Of course, these all combine, so if you use all of these at once with different things, they might cancel each other out. You'll need to set up a more complicated setup of your own if you want to do that. But the idea here is to be able to quickly get things in. So at the moment, if I put this into shading, we're adding this noise texture in as in the previous example, or let's try it in the gloss too. Then the second part of the group is the overrides, because this group is passing an RGB, so I only have to use one socket on the node to send this through. Otherwise, it would take like 3 or 4 of them. So yeah, you can do it the long form way and have 4 sockets instead of each of these 3 if you want, but this has worked for my purposes so far. So if we totally wanted to override this, set our override fact to 1. And there we go. Now we just have this texture instead of our shading mask at all. So this is useful if you wanted to, say, build a whole other shading mask for just this one object, or just, well, one material, or just this part of it. You know, I could add in a diffuse shader and convert it and do that whole process. Or I could have another copy of this shader group, use one of the output masks, do some further conversion on it just for this material, then plug it in here, back into the original group. So, as I said before, just options, options, options. Now if we want to look inside to understand how this group is being unpacked, it's taking in the color, and then it is just splitting those. It's taking our shading mask, and then adding the output of R, and then G is the override, and B is the override fac. So, not too complicated there. Keeps our nodes clean. And then down here, we can, of course, just flat multiply over the image, and this is happening at the very end of the combine. So if you just want something to turn to pure black, or whatever you're inputting, that's what this is for. So again, that's for like line art textures. And then override all is if you want to just override the entire material with whatever you're putting in here, which could be a color, or in this case, I have rendered out the image, and I'm just going to override with a render. So now, if I change things, like my light level, it doesn't make any difference to this guy, because that's actually just an image. That's not the shader anymore. So that is for if I had, say, gone into another program and painted over the whole image, or done filters on it, or whatever processing, and I was very happy with that object, but wanted to keep working on other ones. So again, that's the style of using this like a compositor. So there's lots more controls that could be added to the groups, like if we wanted to add sockets for controlling how dark shadows can be. I think I've got that in some of my other files, because I wanted the shadows on hair to be less dark, because hair is generally slightly transparent. I didn't want to actually use a transparent shader, of course, so it's not hard to add that sort of thing in. You're just doing color math on whatever part of your passes you want. I'm sure there's many things that people will think of, but this should be a good start. The Eevee Toon setup is done, but there's still a little bit more to my overall workflow, and that is compositing in bounce light from cycles. If you were just here for the Eevee Toon shader, you might want to skip this part. So I've added a cycles version of the shader in its own group inside the overall shader group. Let's take a quick look at that. It's not very complicated. It has diffuse and a gloss, made out of a mix of regular and toon shaders. We're not going to go into everything in detail. It has a Fresnel mixing them, and then it has an emit mix, if we want to make it an emission object, which we're not using in this scene, but it's there. And then which gets rendered is controlled by this output node. In 2.8 we have the option of outputting to only cycles or Eevee, so we're just using that. And that has to be set up on every object, unfortunately, well, every material. That can't be put in a group itself, which is a bit annoying. There are other ways to control multiple pass systems, but this will do for now. We're going to have one scene in the file that's for Eevee and one for cycles. But let's take a look at what our cycles version looks like if we switch over to cycles render. This is just 100 samples, so it's not going to be super clean, but that's fine for now. And it's pretty soft. We could make it harder if I upped the amount of the mix factor on the toon, but we're not actually going to be looking at it for the most part. We're only going to be looking at the bounce light that comes from it, so this is fine for now. To get at the bounce light, we need to render it. So I'm going to pause and do that. And here we are in the compositor now with a rendered image. It looks a lot cleaner because I have the denoiser enabled in the render layer. So even though it's only 100 samples, it cleans up pretty easily. Now to look at the indirect light, we have to check out our indirect passes. There's the indirect diffuse, and there's the indirect gloss. And it is horrendously noisy, and that makes it basically totally useless. If we were in 2.81, we'd just hook up the handy new denoise node and use it as is, but we're not, so we need to work around it. By the time you're watching this, well, 2.1 should be well out. But in the meantime, we can make a light source that gives us indirect light only. But first, let's take a look at what this whole image would look like if we combined the passes in cycles. This is the math to do that. There's our diffuse. Then we copy it again for our gloss. It's direct plus indirect times color. There's the gloss. And then to combine it all, add everything together. And we've recreated what comes out of that image socket, except without the denoising, because the passes aren't denoised. Now this has direct light, so if we just wanted the indirect light, remove the direct. There's our indirect on its own, the full combined indirect. And we just want to add this to our Eevee render, actually. But first, let's make that material setup so that we just render this and don't have to go through all this compositor stuff. Rendering only indirect light in cycles is pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of the nodes on the lights themselves. Just like in our material, we have separate outputs. So let's hook this up on the key and the backlight. And then we need to go into the world and disable it entirely. Don't want ambient light in there. And that looks pretty good. The only other setting we need is, for some reason, on the lamps, multiple important sampling needs to be disabled. Otherwise, we still get some direct light. I'm not sure why that is. I don't remember that happening in the past, but whatever. We don't need multiple important sampling for indirect light anyway. So, the way this is working is by using the ray depth, which is the number of times the light has bounced, to control if the light is actually a light or just zero strength and black. So if it hasn't bounced before, which would be direct light, it's zero strength, and if it has bounced, then it's a real light. Therefore, just indirect light. Let's go ahead and render this. And it's done, and it's denoised, so we can use that. But we need to have both Eevee and cycles. So let's go over to our second scene I've set up. First, we'll put this one back to Eevee. And note, I put everything into one collection called Toon Test Scene. Now if we go over to this cycle scene, the only thing in here is a group instance of the Toon Test Scene collection. So we can't actually interact with anything, and if we make any changes in that collection, all of those will be updated here. So once this scene is made, we never need to think about it again, except for if we want to adjust the settings. The camera also exists in this cycles collection. So back over to Eevee. We can make a separate scene node, which will be set to cycles. And now let's pause and render again. And there's our Eevee. There's our indirect light. All we have to do is add them together. And there we go. Indirect light. We've got back all the reflections and stuff Eevee can't normally do. Good metallics, bounce light, mirrors, all that sort of thing. Or We could also use this to composite more stuff from cycles in the future to get fancier lighting or maybe to fix our shadow problems, but I'm still working on that. For now, I think this is enough. And we've reached the end. We have our fancy Eevee Toon group and our fancy cycles map slide, and we have fused them together into some fancy artistic shader that I don't even know what to call at this point. Thank you everybody for watching. Check the description for a link to download this file and for my Facebook and Twitter, where you may send me questions or ask for other topics to be covered in future videos. I'll be doing more about different parts of my character workflow, and I promise to keep them shorter than this one. For now, please like and subscribe for more updates. Thank you.